أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة المتقين والصلاة والسلام على رسول كريم سيدنا محمد وآله وأصحابه أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. All praise due to Allah, the Lord, cherisher, nourisher, sustainer and master of the universe, the most gracious, the most beneficent, the most merciful. Ya Allah, it is only you that we worship and it is your guidance that we seek. Ya Allah, keep us in the straight path. Ya Allah, shower us with your choice of blessings. Ya Allah, shower us with your mercy. Ya Allah, guide us. Greetings, salam, salutations on our beloved Nabi Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's 12 minutes past 7 Central African time on this warm Monday evening, the 7th of April 2025, and we say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to you, and we welcome you to the Business Matters on Radio Ansar. Business Matters is brought to you by the Minara Chamber of Commerce, and my name is Faisal MJ Sulaiman. I'm your host this evening. The topic for discussion this evening is value and principles of Sharia banking, and our special guest is Brother Ameen Hassen, the head of Sharia banking for Standard Bank South Africa. We say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Brother Ameen Hassen.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Uncle, is it Yusuf or Yunus?
I think it's
Faisal.
It's just straight Faisal Suleiman, that's it. Faisal.
No, I can't. I have to say uncle, man.
No, okay. We'll fight about this off air. Yeah, but I mean, Jazakallah khair for joining me on the program this evening. I see we have, an excellent topic, something that affects all of us, and something that we need to, appraise ourselves with, learn about this concept, and we're discussing value and principles of Sharia banking. Now, I was about to say Rafiq, sorry, man. What are the core principles of Sharia banking, and how do they differentiate from conventional banking systems? What's the difference between the two?
I think generally we try and categorize it into two things. We categorize it into a qualitative difference and a quantitative difference.
Mm-hmm.
The quantitative difference everybody would be familiar with. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us very clearly in the Quran that interest is forbidden in all of our transactions. Mm-hmm. So the first difference is the quantitative. We ensure that interest is eradicated from all transactions. The second one, which we call a qualitative difference, is we ensure that money within the system does not get deployed into haram industries or what could be broadly categorized as sin or unethical industries. Mm-hmm. So an investor in a Sharia compliant product, either in an asset management product, an insurance product, or a banking product, the managers of those funds will ensure that your money doesn't get deployed into the likes of an tobacco stock or an alcohol beverage or an arms or weapons manufacturer. So these are the two main screens. Quantitative eradicates interest from the transaction. Qualitative ensures haram and sin industries are not invested in.
Now, are there enough industries, is there enough asset management that's available that is Sharia compliant? I mean, the first thing is, I'm sure it's quite problematic finding, the interest-free and then the problematic product-free, if I can put it that way in my language.
Look, Uncle Faisal, I must be honest, right? It's not easy. It is difficult, so especially within Muslim minority countries. So if you look at South African landscape, the JSE has created something that we call the JSE Sharia Top 40. Mm-hmm. If you analyze that index, or those basket of equities on the stock exchange, you'll notice that they're very heavily weighted to resources. When we say resources, we speak about hard commodities like mining, mm-hmm. and that sort of thing. You will almost never find a truly balanced portfolio of equities that would include real estate, financials, institutions, industrials, pharmaceuticals, etc., because many of these equities get excluded from the investment universe because they don't pass the basic screens. However, if you go into more mature markets like Malaysia, Singapore, the GCC nations, in those areas you will find more stocks. And if you look at bigger exchanges like Standard & Poor's index or what we call the S&P 500, if you go into the Dow Jones, the NASDAQ, on those bigger exchanges, you do find a wider range of portfolios to invest in. But in Muslim minority countries, it is difficult. It's available, but difficult to find a truly balanced portfolio.
Now, can you explain how profit and loss sharing works in Sharia banking and how it ensures fairness in financial transactions?
This is set out in the Quran. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran the manner in which you must transact is based on the principle of la tadlimun wa la tudlamun. Do not dispense prejudice, neither allow prejudice to be done to you. So this is the principle of how we ensure fairness in the transaction. And the profit and loss sharing is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala categorizes very clearly in the Quran, وَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted trade and He has forbidden riba. Now, although these transactions may look and feel similar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even says this, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَى. There are some people that will say that trading is the same as riba. وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. But Allah has permitted trade and forbidden riba. So this is how profit and loss sharing works. We ensure that prejudice is not affected in the transaction, and we ensure that the transactions meet the definition of trade and not riba. And these are set out there. There's so many examples during the time of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam that set out some of the parameters of these types of transactions.
Now, how does Sharia banking promote ethical investments, and what role does it play in supporting socially responsible businesses?
I think the Sharia always promoted this with its qualitative screen, ensuring that investments are not done in unethical industries. However, what we're starting to see is this become a lot more pervasive in the universe, and we're seeing what we call the convergence of multiple sectors or multiple themes. So you now have the green theme emerging, you have the ESG theme emerging. And my personal opinion on the matter is it was Islam, the onset of Islamic finance that actually gave rise to these themes in the world. Islamic finance brought ethical investing to the mainstream financial universe. And because we were something that operated on the periphery, people didn't take as much note of it. But now that it's becoming more mainstream, you're seeing these themes converging. So my belief, it was always there. It's just becoming more apparent than it used to be.
Just to remind our listeners that you are listening to Business Matters, brought to you by the Minara Chamber of Commerce and hosted by myself, Faisal MJ Sulaiman. This is an interactive program, so if you have any questions for our special guest, Brother Mohammed Ameen Hassen, who is the head of Sharia banking for Standard Bank of South Africa, and our topic for discussion is value and principles of Sharia banking. If you have any questions for Mohammed Ameen Hassen, then do forward them to us via WhatsApp on 060 904 1056. I repeat, 060 904 1056. Now, Mohammed Ameen, what role does Sharia compliant financial products play in the broader global financial system, and are they growing in popularity?
Absolutely. So there's some interesting reports that come out. A lot of the time we rely on a report published by what we call the Dinar Standard. It's underpinned by quite a reputable research firm. You'll see the report that comes out there. It's called the State of the Global Islamic Economy Report. And I encourage listeners to do some Googling and go and download this report. It'll give you a much greater and deeper appreciation for broader than just Islamic finance, but a broader Islamic ecosystem and Islamic economy. And based on this report, what we start to see is spending habits of Muslims, as an example. So we make up 2 billion people in the world, and those 2 billion people spend money. So it's estimated that we spend at least 2.3 trillion US dollars on halal food, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, fashion, travel, media, and this is growing significantly year on year. When it comes specifically to finance, Islamic finance assets have been estimated to be tipping about $4 trillion US dollars, and it's projected to double by 2026. The last count was latter part of 2022. And I think this is really showing a great deal of growth. If you take overall investments, there's been nearly $26 billion worth of investments, which is growing at nearly 100% year-on-year growth. So definitely big growth. It's no longer something that operates at the peripheries of the global economy.
Speaking of global economy, it appears, and I'm subject to correction, that those countries that are sort of practicing Islamic banking or Sharia banking or a Sharia economy as such, although none of them are doing it 100%, they seem to be in a far better wicket than those that are sort of practicing capitalism. You can correct me on this.
Look, we operate within a globalized economy, right? So I don't think there's any economy in the world that would be completely immune
Absolutely
or
not.
resistant to any global macro trends, right? So if you take what's happening now with US tariffs, I don't think whether you're an Islamic economy or a conventional economy, you're going to be impacted by that. There are moves to create better working economy. So if you take Malaysia as an example, which is possibly the most mature Islamic finance in the market, they now run two central banks. They run an Islamic central bank and they run a conventional Islamic bank, conventional interest-bearing bank. So you're starting to see much more mature markets creating holistic Islamic economies. If we go back to some of the historical data, what we have seen is Islamic finance products, because they are either asset-based or asset-backed and not based on pure speculation or credit swaps, they were much more resistant to shocks like the 2008 global crisis. So statistically, if you look at the historical data, when the 2008 financial crisis started to hit all parts of the world, Islamic finance economy was actually the most resilient, given the structure of the products being asset-based or asset-backed. So I think it's difficult to say at an overall economy level of a country, because we in such an interconnected, globalized economy, macro trends will always shock at a country level. But at a financial instrument or financial institution level, we definitely saw that Islamic finance institutions were much better off through that period.
In fact, I was at a convention a while ago, and they mentioned specifically that those that are practicing these Islamic principles seem to be in a much better wicket. And in fact, the country I was in, they were also thinking of sort of adopting quite a bit of those Islamic principles as well, to the effect that they wanted to introduce Islamic financial law, if I can put it, or Sharia compliant financial law into the syllabi as well, just so that people can become au fait with the relevant requirements. But having said that, how does Sharia law ensure that banking practices avoid activities that are considered forbidden, such as interest or excessive uncertainty?
Faisal, this is such an important question. I think especially in the times that we're living in, where people have a lot of questions around how we implement. Globally, there are two predominant operating models in Islamic financial institutions: banks, insurers, or asset managers. You have what we call standalone banks or standalone institutions. These are institutions that only sell Sharia compliant products. So it's easier to understand that the entire mandate is to only do stuff in a Sharia compliant way. You then have what we call window operations, and window operations are globally the most used operations across asset managers, insurers, and banks. Essentially what this is it's a business unit that is constituted within the conventional institution, and that business unit is solely responsible for ensuring that customers of that unit is Sharia compliant. So we use various ways. We have legal contracts in which we ensure it. We have technology systems that ensure that funds are ring-fenced, clearly identified. We have mandates that are given and service level agreements that are given out to different business units internally and externally to ensure that the mandate of the Sharia investor is fulfilled. And as we're reaching more global maturity, these contracts are becoming more familiar with the conventional universe. So it's becoming a lot more easier to transact in the globalized economy that we operate with.
Mm-hmm. Now, just on a bit of a personal level, if I can put it, what I mean is that there's often lots of criticism, etc., against, Sharia banks and things like that. How do you deal with that? Because obviously, you can never be 100% compliant.
Well, I disagree with the statement that you can never be 100% compliant. I think if, there's a principle that, and I must be as, there's no way of being not blunt in this particular
You
response.
need to be.
Right?
This question has come from a listener, actually. Mm-hmm.
There's a principle in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala beds down a principle. He says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. That if you don't know something, you must ask those that know, right? What we have is we have non-financial experts, we have non-bankers or non-financial people that don't understand neither finance nor the technicalities of fiqh al-mu'amalat, that stand on the outside and pass judgment on whether what we are doing as Islamic finance practitioners are 100% compliant or even non-compliant. If you actually come into the system and understand what the practitioners do and the fiqh that they rely on, you'll see that the fiqh is actually well established globally. I mean, if you take global scholars that are coming out of the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the Indo-Pak subcontinent, scholars of absolute repute have opined on so many of these structures and rooted them back into our primary sources of jurisprudence. So I think the criticism will always be there. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His infinite wisdom calls this out. He says, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَا. They will be those that say that trading is the same as interest. And that's what's happening today, is we are conducting something which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted, and it has similar economic outcome as conventional products, and people are saying, it's the same as interest. So exactly the words of the Quran is coming true today.
No, thank you for that clarification. Actually, there was a question that came from a listener who asked that he remain anonymous, but then that's why I just posed that. Anyway, Mohammed, we need to take an ad break. We are discussing finance. We also want to go to the marketplace. Do stay with us. We'll take an ad break. We'll continue after this, inshallah. Yes, you listen to Business Matters, brought to you by the Minara Chamber of Commerce and hosted by myself, Faisal M.J. Suleiman. Our topic for discussion this evening is value and principles of Sharia banking. And our guest this evening is Brother Mohammed Ameen Hassen, the head of Sharia banking for Standard Bank South Africa. This is an interactive program. If you have any questions on Sharia banking, you may forward them to us via WhatsApp on 060-904-1056. That's 060-904-1056. Now, Mohammed Ameen, in your experience, how do Sharia compliant financial institutions balance the need for profitability with adherence to Islamic principles?
I think we definitely do this to the best of our ability. And if you look at every economic system in the world, if you take capitalism as an example, capitalism is rooted in the value of freedom. And if you take socialism is rooted in the value of equality. But if you analyze what is the Islamic economic system, or not just the Islamic economic system, but the system of Islam, what is the value that is the most emphasis placed on? And we find this in the verse of the Quran, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنكَرِ وَالْبَغْيِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us bil-adl, with justice. So the greatest aspiration that we have as financial institutions to balance the need for profitability with adherence to Islamic principles is adl, is justice. So remember, Islamic principles will always be upheld irrespective of whether profitability is there or not. But how we balance profitability in commercial enterprises is maintaining this adl. And I think sometimes what we overlook is in the economies in which we operate, there are actually significant amount of regulatory guardrails that prevent unfair behavior or unscrupulous behavior and profit-seeking behavior in the marketplace. And given that we are financial institutions that are regulated, this also serves as a secondary guardrail to the consumer of these products.
Mm-hmm. There's a question that's coming from a listener. It says, great topic. Can you discuss the growth of Sharia banking globally and its potential for future development?
I think we covered some of those elements earlier. We're currently sitting at about $5 trillion US dollars globally in Islamic finance assets, and I think we should reach about $6 trillion. In terms of some of the key areas in which we believe growth would come, the first is wider adoption. I think if you look at GCC and Southeast Asia, there's definitely significant adoption from the vast majority of consumers. I think shows like this within Muslim minority countries where we eradicate some of the misconceptions and bring greater adoption to the products would aid growth. The second is we still operate for the vast of Africa. Even though majority of Africa is Muslim, I think the largest growth vector for Islamic finance will be Africa, given that nearly a billion of the 2 billion Muslims reside in Africa. But one of the greatest inhibitors for adoption of Islamic finance products across the African continent is legislation. So we need to ensure that the laws are updated across these countries to ensure tax parity and ensure that these products are treated fairly and they are legal tender or legal products in the country.
I think you've dealt with this question, but I'm just going to repeat it. What impact has Sharia banking had on the economies of Muslim majority countries, and how does it contribute to their financial stability and growth?
I think one of the greatest things that we always look at, remember in these Muslim majority countries, these are mature Islamic finance economies. They have all of the legislation available. They've got central governance systems. Generally, if you're trying to measure the maturity or the impact of a particular market in these types of environments, I like to look at the M&A sector or the mergers and acquisition sector or the venture capital sector, because once you've exhausted a certain growth vector, you then only try and grow through mergers or acquisitions. So if you look at some of the deals, for example, that have been disclosed over the past 18 to 24 months, we've seen nearly $1 billion US in MENA, in the MENA region that have taken place. There were 67 deals across MENA, GCC, and Southeast Asia that were executed. 47 of those transactions had disclosed values, and these values were nearly $15 billion US. So what we learn from this, or what we can see from this, is over and above the $4 trillion, $5 trillion US that is there within Islamic finance, and over and above the nearly $3 trillion US of consumer spending that's taking place. There's another $15 billion US of mergers and acquisitions that are taking place, where companies are buying other companies or merging with other companies. This is a very great proxy for growth, and I think the impact of this can't be underestimated. If you look at some of these Muslim majority countries, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, if you look at their GDP numbers, definitely high single digits, and some of them double-digit growth over the past 20 years. Slowing down now because of the global slowdown in growth, but definitely still solid, stable economies.
Let's look at it from a customer's point of view. What are the benefits of Sharia banking for customers?
If you take the South African, let's take the South African example, right? As South Africans, we operate within one of the most mature financial systems in the market. So over and above fulfilling the religious requirement of eradicating interest from your transactions, you operate within a sophisticated financial system. You've got the latest tech. You've got one of the best regulatory systems in the world. The JSE and the FSCA have been lauded for their regulatory regimes. So if you look at a customer that consumes Sharia compliant from any one of the 4 big banks in South Africa that are window operations, or the one standalone bank in South Africa that only sells Sharia compliant products and services, all of these banks have the latest tech They are well regulated, well capitalized. There isn't any doubt that these or any one of the big banks in South Africa offer great product and service. So I think the general consumer in South Africa can be rest assured of that. The second is we have scholars of great repute across all of these boards. So we run great governance processes. Most of the institutions in South Africa adopt IOFI, which is the global standard setter for product and governance. We as South Africa have adopted IOFI governance principles within everything that we do. The caution that I will put out to listeners is we as an industry are trying our very best to create the appropriate guardrails to protect consumers. And my advice to consumers, if you allow me, Uncle Faisal,
yes, go for
is consumers should look for providers that are registered financial services providers. Then you are assured of the fact that you've got the South African regulator, the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, that is overseeing the practices of that institution, that is ensuring that it is well-governed institutions, the Prudential Authority coming in and ensuring that these institutions are well-capitalized, have adequate liquidity ratios. These are elements over and above Sharia compliance that consumers should look for when making investment decisions.
Jazakallah khair for that. There's a question from a brother Imran, and he says, Salams, excellent program. Can you ask your guest to maybe explain some of the various Sharia banking products that that exist? And he refers to things like Murabaha and Mudaraba, etc.
Sure. So in South Africa, our tax laws have 4 main Sharia products that have been recognized. The first product, which is recognized, is an Ijara product. The full name of the product is Ijara Muntahiya Bitamlik. This is a leasing product. Generally, we see that vehicle and asset finance products across Islamic financial institutions are structured on Ijara, where the bank buys the vehicle, leases the vehicle out to the customer, and at the end of the term, the customer then buys the vehicle at the end of term. So this is Ijara Muntahiya Bitamlik. It's a sale and leaseback type structure. Then you have Mudaraba. Mudaraba is generally a profit-sharing agreement and is used to structure investment products. There are 2 main characters in a Mudaraba transaction. You have what we know as Rabbul Mal, the owner of the money or the investor or the depositor, and you have the Mudarib. The Mudarib is the manager of that fund. So a typical relationship, a depositor or the owner of that money would give their money to a bank who is the Mudarib, and they appoint the Mudarib to invest their money in Sharia compliant activities. In the terms and conditions of your agreement, the Mudarib would set out what the profit sharing ratios are, what the nature of the relationship is between the investor and the manager of those funds. The last 2 recognized structures within South African law is what we call diminishing musharaka. Musharaka loosely translates as a partnership. So this structure is used for property finance, where the bank and the customer jointly own the property, and the customer buys back equity from the bank at a diminishing rate. So this is why it's called diminishing musharaka, a diminishing partnership, and rental is charged for the portion of the property that is still owned by the bank. And the last one is what we call Murabaha. Murabaha is a classic sale where you buy something and you sell something at a profit, and both capital and profit is known upfront. Generally, we see that Murabaha is used for trade finance. A typical example is you are a store owner, you need to buy stock from a supplier. The bank would buy stock from the supplier for you and sell the stock to you at a margin, and that would aid your working capital. So these are the 4 structures that are currently recognized within South Africa. There are other structures globally in much more mature economies, and alhamdulillah, as an industry, we're working with the regulator as well as the legislator to try and get the legislation updated so we can bring more sophisticated product to the market.
060-904-1056. Any questions on value and principles of Sharia banking? You can forward them to us via WhatsApp, and our special guest this evening, Brother Mohammed Ameen Hassen, the head of Sharia banking for Standard Bank South Africa, will attempt to answer those questions. Brother Mohammed Ameen, the question has come through. Can you ask your guest to explain what is sukuk, please? S-U-K-U-K.
Sukuk is an Arabic word. It is the plural form of the Arabic word sak. Sak originates in the classical period of the Islamic history, where you had, it's essentially a promissory note. So when global trade, as the Islamic economy started to grow during the classical period of Islam, it became difficult to transfer goods and services without immediate payment. So the leaders of the Islamic world at that point in time created an instrument called a sak, which was a promissory note. So you could transfer your goods against this promissory note, and when your goods were delivered, you would then get payment, or the delivery of your gold or the currency of the time would then be delivered. So that is what its roots are. It's a promissory note. In today's modern day context, it loosely translates as a bond or a debt instrument. So let's say, for example, a classic example would be a government of a country is trying to raise money for infrastructure and they want to do it in a Sharia compliant way. They issue certificates out into the marketplace that denote ownership of either an asset or it's based on an asset transaction. And by virtue of this, the certificate holders have a right to the asset itself or the usufruct of that asset. And from that, the holder of that instrument is then entitled to a return. So loosely translates as a bond in today's term, but original definition of the word sak was a promissory note.
Mm-hmm. Now let's look at some challenges. What are some of the challenges that face Sharia banking, and are there any opportunities as such for innovation, expansion, etc.?
Absolutely. Within the South African context and Muslim minority context, innovation is key for us. We have to ensure that we continuously innovate and bring best-in-class products to our consumers. The second thing around innovation is, I think, largely speaking, what we find is that Sharia banking was knee-jerk in reaction globally. So up to the time of 1976, when the Bretton Woods Accord took place and gold was eradicated as the reserve currency of the world and fiat currency started to come into existence, we found that the institutionalization of Islamic finance was not there. The institutionalization of Islamic finance only came in at that point in time when gold as a currency was abolished. So in the initial years, Islamic finance on a knee-jerk basis or a reactionary basis needed to ensure that product and services were Sharia compliant. So we replicated existing products. We replicated a check account, a savings account, a bond, a car finance product, and we found in the classical jurisprudence structures or transaction types in the time of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and applied them to modern day constructs. I think where the greatest opportunity for growth comes through is that Islamic finance now becomes leaders in product, and the conventional world now follows us, and we move more from a Sharia compliant economy into a Sharia based economy, where we're not only measuring the compliance of a product and ensuring that it's Sharia compliant, but we ascribe to a higher purpose like the maqasid al-Sharia, the objectives of Sharia, and ensure that some of these are fulfilled in the economies in which we operate.
And how does Sharia banking promote financial inclusion and social responsibility?
There was a survey that was done in mid-2010s by the International Monetary Fund. And what they wanted to find out was, can Islamic finance actually increase the rate of financial inclusion? And our audience can Google this report. It's publicly available from the IMF website. So the research was done across Africa. And what they found was a noticeable portion of the population actually formally excluded themselves from financial services for religious reasons, because there was no Islamic finance product, so they formally excluded themselves. So there's definitely data that suggests, based on global research, that when Islamic finance does enter a country, it does improve and increase the rate of financial inclusion. We've certainly seen that within the South African market, where you had two types of populations. You had an unbanked population or an underbanked population. And since the onset of Islamic finance, what we've definitely seen is an improvement in those numbers. So there is data that suggests it. There needs to be refreshed research on measuring it at a more later date, but definitely we've seen that come through.
And I think finally, I'm sure there are some benefits of Sharia banking for the consumers. Do you know, just allude to some of the benefits?
I think the largest benefit for me would be you're not at war at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right?
Of course, absolutely.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Adhanu biharbin min Allahi wa rasuli." Beware of a war from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I think that's the greatest benefit. The second is, I think what we work within a globalized economy, and as much as we would like to exclude ourselves from this economy, you actually would do that to your detriment. If you're unable to participate in the global economy and the formal economy, as we call it, your opportunity to grow yourself and protect your wealth. So remember, one of the objectives of the Sharia is hifdhul mal, the protection of your wealth. And the manner in which the world has evolved is there are sophisticated mechanisms in which you protect your wealth. So I think one of the largest benefits that consumers have with the onset of Islamic finance is you can fulfill the protection of your wealth and also grow your wealth in a Sharia compliant way. So you don't need to exclude yourself from the financial system because there isn't a halal option. There is a halal option. You can protect your wealth and grow it in a Sharia compliant way.
Okay, I know I use the word finally in my last question, but this time I mean finally. Can a Sharia compliant system work successfully within a conventional system?
I think so. I think if you look at some meaningful Muslim populations across the world, let's take Nigeria as a good example. Nigeria is nearly 50% Christian, 50% Muslim. Nigeria at the central bank level has created a Sharia board. They call the phrase the Federal, I can't get what the R stands for, Advisory Committee of Experts. But they basically a Sharia board that sits at the central bank that ensures that whatever happens in that country in terms of Islamic finance is Sharia compliant. Nigeria over the past few years have raised hundreds of billions of nairas in Sharia compliant, and the Sharia board of the Central Bank of Nigeria have imposed that they need to ensure that the proceeds of these funds go into infrastructure and development. They even went a step further and they said they're not calling this Islamic finance in the country. They're calling it non-interest banking, because they believe that the values espoused in this is for both Muslim and non-Muslim. So I think Nigeria is definitely a success story. If you look at Malaysia, Malaysia has now created a central bank. And if you look at a lot of the GCC nations, they have successfully created Sharia compliant economies operating within a globalized non-compliant system. So I think there is definitely growth. The State of the Global Islamic Economy report records this. I mean, $5 trillion is not a small number.
Absolutely.
It's a proper number. So I think there's definitely success, and it's with the support of our Muslim community, eradicating misnomers, eradicating misconceptions, seeking knowledge from those people that know. I think we'll grow this, and we definitely become a meaningful contributor to the global economy and a viable alternative to conventional financial systems.
Brother Mohammed, Ameen, Hassen, Jazakallah khair for joining me in the program this evening. And I think in 1 minute, maybe you can just give us your parting advice to our listeners.
The first is, please make me maaf. I called you a wrong name in the beginning.
No issues at all. That's no issues.
The second is my appeal to my brothers and sisters is, alhamdulillah, we have great practitioners in the industry. We have great scholars in the industry of high repute, and all of these stakeholders put their blood, sweat, and tears into changing laws in South Africa and adopting Sharia-compliant products and services at the highest level, even up to national treasury level. So it would be really a waste of effort if the vast majority of the Muslims in South Africa don't make use of the systems that we've worked so hard for. And we say thanks to our government, we say thanks to our national treasury, we say thanks to the tax authority and the legislator for allowing these laws to be changed and for allowing Muslims in South Africa to consume Sharia compliant products. Let's make it grow as best as we possibly can, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Mohammed Ameen Hassen, and thanks to you as well. And Jazakallah khair once again for joining me on the program this evening. All the best to you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
We spoke to Brother Mohammed Ameen Hassen, and he spoke to us on Sharia banking. I want to thank Sister Amina for having produced the show, and thank Zakaria Umar for having engineered and being the tech this evening. The next of course, thank the Minara Chamber of Commerce for having hosted the show as well. The next program we're going to be listening to is our news, which will be read by Brother Eric Imonia, and thereafter we'll be joining Mufti Abdul Qadir Hussain on Q&A, and Q&A will be hosted by Hafiz Hussain Wadi, inshallah. From myself, Faisal MJ Sulaiman, do enjoy the rest of the evening, and all the best to you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.